Well, thank you for the very warm welcome that you've given to me this week. I've enjoyed the interaction with students. Yesterday, I had the opportunity during the pizza lunch to meet with a number of you that came with the SMF group and really enjoyed that interaction. During that meeting, I said to some of the students, well, I'm going to talk about that tomorrow, or I'm going to talk about that Friday. So this is the chance for those questions to be answered that we had delayed until today. Those of you who have been with us the past few days remember the main thesis of what I've been saying, and that is that to understand the future of the seminary, we need to understand the nature of the seminary. And the nature of the seminary is that it's a hybrid institution. It stands on 2 feet, 2 pillars, the pillar of the church and the pillar of the academy. And as the church changes, the seminary responds to those changes in the leadership needs and the context of the church. And as the academy changes, then the seminary reflects those practices and policies that we find within the academy. That's true in North America, and it's also true in the focus of our week this week, and that is in the majority world. We see these two foundational perspective as we look at the future of the seminary. Today, what I want to do is look at 3 specific trends that I see in evangelical majority world seminaries that arise out of this perspective. And then tomorrow, I want to look at a 4th trend. The first trend is this, that there has been a decrease in direct Western influence. A decrease in direct Western influence. We see this worked out in a number of different ways. This is actually a fairly long-standing, mature trend because it reflects a decline in Western mission involvement to a certain extent in those majority world seminaries. It also reflects a maturity on the part of those majority world seminaries, something that should cause us to rejoice. So, first of all, a decrease in the number of Westerners as faculty and leaders. I do not have hard statistics on this. I'd love to get them. So this is just an anecdotal kind of approach that I'm giving you. This is a picture from the mid-1970s of the seminary I worked in beginning in 1980. But it gives you an idea of the number of missionaries, obviously the white faces in this context, in proportion to the number of Nigerian faculty that were there. So this is mid-70s. When I came in 1981, there were 7 full-time missionary faculty that were resident at the school. 15 years later, when I left the seminary, it had declined from 7 Western faculty to 2 Western faculty. Here's some of the faculty today. It's a recent picture from their graduation, I believe last year, and there are actually no Nigerian faculty. You like the costumes? There are no, well, it's very contextual. There are no Western faculty in that seminary today, although it continues to be a remarkable place of learning and faith. Perhaps a correlation of that is there has been a decline in the proportion of Western funding. Last year, we surveyed the seminaries that Overseas Council works with. We work with about 100 different seminaries around the world, and we asked them a question about their financial status, and compared to 5 years previous, were they receiving more funds, the same amount, or actually increase in the proportion of funding from overseas? And you can see the results of this, that almost half of the seminaries that we work with actively had seen a decline in the proportion of funding that they receive from the West, and only a very small percentage had actually seen an increase. We also see a decrease in the proportion of faculty of those seminaries that are trained in the West. Now, part of that, of course, is because there are fewer missionary faculty, Western faculty, who would have received training in the West. But it's also true that even the national faculty that are there are less likely to have received their training in the West. So this is another way that we see a decrease in direct Western involvement in those majority world seminaries. So again, just to use a personal example, when I would have arrived in 1981 in Nigeria, all of the faculty, including the Nigerians, had done postgraduate work in Western seminaries. Today, I don't think there's one of that picture that would have received their training, postgraduate training overseas. And those who are in the younger faculty, all of them would have done their postgraduate training right in Nigeria. So, and I don't think that's an exception. As I continue to engage with seminaries around the world, this is a consistent pattern, that there's a decrease in the number of those that are trained in the West. Now, this has tremendous implications, and we're going to talk about that briefly, as to why this is true, and what the implications are for those seminaries and for Western seminaries. But let me share my thoughts about this general trend here on the decrease of direct Western influence. First of all, as I indicated, this actually needs to be seen in a positive light. The maturity that we're seeing in the majority world church to be able to provide qualified faculty for these seminaries and support those seminaries out of local resources is an amazing thing that we need to thank God for. This is a great development, a positive development that we see, that they're able to support and fund and resource the training of leaders for their churches. It's really an amazing thing. It does, of course, beg the question of the future role for Western personnel, Western funding. I'm sure many of you are asking the question, well, what is the role then of somebody like myself? Maybe God is leading you to ministry overseas, as he did for me, and thinking that you're gifted and trained in a way that could be involved in leadership development overseas. Well, let me assure you, and I hear Ron Blue saying amen already, that there is, praise God, there is a role for people like you, people like me, in majority world seminaries. I don't know of one seminary that we work with that would not welcome a long-term qualified, and I will say qualified, faculty member to be with them and to share in the teaching ministry, in the formation ministry that those those majority world seminaries have. There are literally hundreds of seminaries that are at the bachelor's level, where even an MA credentialed faculty would be welcomed. There are short-term opportunities, a large number of short-term opportunities, not only for people like yourselves, but pastors here in the West to go and invest a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, longer, a sabbatical in sharing from their wisdom and experience over there. So there are great opportunities. There are seminaries that are located in less mature areas or areas where the church is under great pressure, where there are no qualified or less qualified number of faculty members, where our I say our Western presence, Western contribution is welcome and needed. And a true partnership with those seminaries is more than available. I mentioned yesterday about the potential now for collaboration between a seminary like DTS and seminaries overseas. Overseas councils also been midwifing relationships between local congregations and having them adopt a majority world seminary. And those relationships have been very fruitful. So there is those opportunities. There are those opportunities. Another thought I had was the challenge of financial viability. This decrease in direct Western involvement has led to a situation where the traditional seminary model is less viable now than it was before in the majority world context. It's less viable because where you had a situation where those seminaries were not contributing to the salaries of missionary staff, or operational expenses were reimbursed, as it were, or funded by Western funds, the traditional seminary model was more viable. But now with the decline in direct Western involvement, it has led to financial sustainability challenges for a large number of those majority world seminaries. And that in turn has led them to explore non-traditional or unconventional models of church leadership development. We'll say more about that in a second. Also, I think that this trend has contributed greatly to contextualization. That the models that we see now are deeply relevant and responsive to the context. In previous years, the Western missionaries tended to reproduce on the field what they themselves had experienced. But now, as you see an increase in the influence of local resources and local people who are perhaps more responsive and attentive to the particular needs and the context, then we see increasing evidence of contextualization. Now, part of that, of course, is contextualization of the theology. That's a different topic. One that's important, but it's a different topic. But I'm thinking about the contextualization of the very educational process, of the models of Christian leadership development. And that's something that we see continually to grow and to evidence. And again, I want to share some examples of that later on this morning. So that's the first trend. The second trend that we see is increasing academic levels in those majority world seminaries. I already hinted at that in a while earlier when I said that they're no longer being trained in the West, but they're being trained there in their own context, because now there are options, there are alternatives for that training of those faculty members. This is a dramatic trend that we've seen in the last couple decades. Again, this is anecdotal, but it's typical of seminaries that we work with, where Dr. Kallenberg and I were. When we came, they had already begun the bachelor's program. That's when the seminary began, with a bachelor's program. 13 years later, they added their master's program. And then a dozen years after that, or 14 years later, they added their doctoral program in 2006. And that's amazing that in just those, 20 years or so, that they went from a bachelor's to a master's to a doctorate in that short space of time. And that's what we're seeing is this increasing rise. There are still a large number of lower level, as it were, academic programs. But it's amazing to see the growth, the development in the academic capacity of the seminaries that we're working with. Now, we do have some specific evidence here, specific data that I want to share with you. This is recent data that has been done through the research of a colleague named Dr. Evan Hunter at Scholar Leaders International. Scholar Leaders is an association that works with a lot of these majority world doctoral programs and seminaries. And his research shows that in 2003, there were a total of 5 evangelical doctoral level programs in the majority world. 5. Count them on one hand. 10 years later, that's a multiple of 4. 4 times. There are 20. There are actually even more now, but 20 in 10 years. And that doesn't even count the Doctor of Ministry programs, which have actually proliferated even more quickly than the PhD programs. This is one of those programs at Sateca, where they have a PhD in theological education. The number of students, then, that are coming to the West for their PhDs has declined. This graph shows the number of foreign students in PhD programs in ATS, that is North American seminaries. And that same time period, 2003 to 2013, you see a decline in the number of foreign students, specifically doctoral level students. 22% decline. Now, you could say, well, okay, maybe it's more difficult to get visas to the US, or maybe it's something about the economy. Well, what I did is I cross-referenced that against the number of total doctoral students coming from overseas for other subjects, not theological subjects. And what I saw during that same period was an increase. But theological students have declined. Okay, I think that points to a fact, and that is that there are now options, there are now alternatives for theological faculty to be trained in their own contexts rather than coming to the West. In just the last 3 years, we've seen continued increase in the number of evangelical doctoral students studying in their own contexts. 45% in just 3 years, the number has grown. So there is a continued trend, a clear and obvious trend as to the direction that we're seeing. And we are going to see fewer doctoral students coming to Western seminaries than we have in the past. Now, as I said, that's a cause to rejoice, but it does mean there are challenges. There are challenges to the majority world seminary in offering that level, that academic level. There are, as I mentioned yesterday, challenges for library resources appropriate for that academic level, for faculty who are trained for doctoral supervision. That's a challenge. To blend what is universal in a doctoral program to what is contextual and relevant for that particular situation. But if there are challenges for the majority world seminary, there are also challenges for the Western seminary, who no longer have the benefit of that non-Western voice, which now represents the majority of world Christianity, in their own theological conversations. That's a deficit. How can we compensate for that loss of the voice of the majority world church on our campus? How can we continue to have a global influence in a positive way of what God is doing in India, for instance? It's a challenge for seminaries such as DTS. Okay, I've mentioned increasing academic levels. The third trend, and this is the one I want to spend a little bit more time on, is the increased diversity of programs. Now, this is amazing. There is no longer one traditional, standard, expected kind of program that we see in the majority world. The dominance of the traditional model, which is campus-centric, residential, location-dependent, face-to-face interaction, that traditional model continues to decline. Now, it still exists, but it is definitely on the decline. It's a model that, as you know, the modern version of it goes back to German universities several hundred years ago, but we could even trace it further back if you look at the origins of the university in the Middle Ages 1,000 years ago. This picture is painted in 1350 of a typical classroom in Italy. So you're already seeing what I wanted to point out to you. Some things don't change. Here's the four walls, the teacher, the desk lined up, the textbooks, and obviously the people in the front row are fairly engaged with what's happening. People in the back row, a little bit less so. There's one woman here that I noticed was very engaged. It looked like maybe too engaged, too interested in what was going on, or maybe it was the teacher that she found so fascinating. This couple seemed to find something else to talk about rather than what's actually happening in class. This guy thinks that the most interesting thing happening in class is sitting right next to him. And of course, this guy thinks that nothing in the class is interesting. So some things don't change in the traditional classroom. Okay, that's for free. All right. So I was mentioning this diminishing traditional seminary model. And what we're seeing then replacing it is, again, not one other model, but we're seeing this diversity of different models that retain the function of theological education, but do so in an amazing variety of different forms that are appropriate to the changing contexts of the churches those programs serve. Now, what are the different aspects of that diversity? I think the best way to answer that question is just the who, what, where, when, how kind of questions. That's where the diversity comes from. So who are the students? Again, those students that used to be able to come or that would be able to come to a traditional 2, 3, 4-year program have been excluded in that traditional model. And so there has been an attempt to try to include and provide access for those students. Students who, as I said, couldn't come to a traditional program or who may not be interested in coming to a traditional program. Greater access and particular training needs is what we're seeing. Particular training needs. It's as though the seminary student says, or the potential seminary student says, I don't actually need for this ministry a 2, 3, 4-year program. I need something immediate, on demand, for this particular need. It's as though he were saying, I don't need a full meal at a restaurant. I just need to go to the cafeteria and get an apple. That's all I need. Do you have an apple? And that's the question that the students are asking. Here's an illustration of one. I could give countless illustrations. This is at the Ukrainian Evangelical Theological Seminary last year. And the specific need is out of the growing conflict, not the growing conflict, the conflict in eastern Ukraine and the trauma that has resulted in the soldiers, the volunteers, the civilians from the Donbass region in Ukraine, and the lack of chaplains that were prepared to address that need. And so the Ukrainian Evangelical Theological Seminary says, here's a need, we can do this, and in one intensive week, they brought in staff, faculty, to train 72 different people to be volunteer chaplains. What are they being taught? This is a question, of course, of the curriculum, which now we see these specialized programs running from more non-formal programs to formal programs of different lengths, of different curricula, different shapes, different topics. Here's an example, a couple examples. The Asia Graduate School of Theology offering a program, a PhD in holistic childhood development. I don't think it's offered by Dallas Seminary. That's not a critique. It's saying that the context in the Philippines and Asia is different. And so Compassion International comes to AGST and says, we need to train workers for our churches in holistic childhood development. Can you help us? Or this example of the Ethiopian Graduate School of Theology. HIV/AIDS is a huge issue, and it's a complex issue which needs leaders who understand the economic, the social, the religious, medical challenges of living with HIV/AIDS and how the church can attend to that challenge. A very specific need in different contexts, different challenges, different responses. Programs that do not look like the traditional program that we are usually familiar with. When are they being taught? Instead of the 2, 3, 4-year program, we're seeing a much greater diversity in terms of creative scheduling, part-time, weekend, week evening courses, modular courses. Those are on the rise dramatically. Again, some numbers that will back this up. We did a survey a few years ago, again, of our partner schools. These were in Europe. And we asked those schools, over the last 5 years, have you seen an increase in the number of full-time students? Over half, 59%, said they had seen a decrease in the number of full-time students. Part-time students, 70% of the seminaries saw an increase in the number of part-time students. Okay? Creative scheduling. Moving away from the traditional model, which might be expected of a full-time, 2, 3, 4 year-long residential program. And there's also a growing realization that just because you come for 2, 3, 4 years doesn't mean it's once and done. That there are continuing opportunities for professional development, that the seminary has the opportunity to continue to provide a continuing education in modules to those graduates and to others that need further education and development. Where are they being taught? Again, what we see is a movement away from the campus-centric model, where the teacher is, where the information is, to a much more distributed model, using extension programs, satellite campuses, online education, modular kind of courses that are in one particular area. Church-based education. One of the schools that really impresses me is the Colombo Theological Seminary in Sri Lanka, off the coast of south coast of India. CTS, and I know some of the faculty here have been to this campus, Colombo campus in the capital, about 10 years ago, they realized that they could not expect people to come to the Colombo campus. At the time, there was conflict between the Sinhalese and the Tamil people in the north. And so what they did is they began 2 centers in the north of the country. Since then, they've added another 8 or 9 centers. And now 1/3 of their 1,000 students are enrolled in those extension centers around the island. Again, this is typical. This is all over. We see this kind of model that's being developed with extension courses. And now Seminary is doing something very similar. How are they being taught? That's the mode of delivery. The traditional model, of course, is the content is text-based, it's in the library, and the interaction between the students and the faculty and the students themselves is face-to-face. But again, all of that is changing primarily with technology, but not only with technology. I'm going to give you a very creative example here. This is the Bangkok Bible Seminary in Thailand. And over the last 4 years, they've developed a program which allows for students who are located in Bangkok that don't want to fight the Bangkok traffic, other places in Thailand, and other Thai students in the diaspora around the world. And they're offering a master's program in Christian studies to 100 different students over a course of 12 different evenings, 12 different courses, evening courses. But again, instead of asking the seminary, or instead of asking the students to come to the seminary, they're able to develop this very creative capacity to interact with the live classes that are happening on campus. This is just a hodgepodge of different technologies that they've put together. And now 100 students access those classes from different parts of the world. What was amazing to me is you're thinking, okay, this is going to be money to start it. The total startup costs was $3,000 for this program. And it's been going for 4 years, continues to develop. So this blended online program with live stream and access for students who want to continue the interaction at real time is available. Well, what we're seeing here then is this diversity of programs. There is no one standard model. There is no one right model because the contexts are different. The unique challenges are different. The leadership needs are different. And seminaries are responding to those particular leadership needs. And that's what has caused this diversity of programs that we see. And as the context changes, those programs will continue to change. And so no longer is there no one right model or standard model. There's no one permanent model because the context will continue to change. And what we see, a characteristic of the seminary of the future, is flexibility. Now, I mention this constellations of innovation because what I see in the majority world is this amazing ability to innovate and to move outside of the traditional walls of what we think of as seminary education. That's very encouraging, frankly, to see how they are innovating in ways that will more effectively form Christian leaders for their churches. Well, what is it? Let me suggest a few possibilities. Is it the recognition that majority world problems will not be solved by Western solutions? Is it the decreasing resources from the West that has forced seminaries to seek new ways of doing things in more sustainable models? Is it a new sense of mission on the part of the seminary, not just to equip students, but to serve the church? Is it a movement away from a mission of the seminary, from a professional paradigm to a congregational paradigm? Is it the comparative lack of academic regulation, which is found in many majority world countries? Is it a newfound confidence of majority world Christians to depart from inherited traditional models? Is it access to new technology, which is accelerating the movement away from the campus-centric education? I think we can be deeply encouraged to see the responses of the seminaries to the needs of the church in models such as I've described. These models are fragile and they need continued support. But what I see is seminaries that are effectively forming Christian leaders, seminaries that are rooted in their mission and calling, that are responsive to the changing needs in the church, that are accessible to the kinds of students that need training and formation, and that are sustainable within their contexts. And this is the seminary of the future. Thank you.